On April 2nd, 1988, a naked man with a dog collar around his neck leapt from a second-story window and crashed to the ground below. The window he'd just fallen down from was on Charlotte Street, and the house belonged to a man named Robert Berdella. With no one pursuing him, the naked man ran towards a nearby meter reader who helped him call the police. When the police arrived at the Berdella house, they discovered a pile of photos taken of different men who had been held captive there. And in the backyard, what they discovered would earn him the nickname The Collector. This is the story of one of the most deranged serial killers in American history. Robert Berdella was born in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio in 1949. He was raised Catholic, though he stopped attending church services when he became a teenager. His father, who would often beat him with a leather strap, worked as a die setter for the Ford Motor Company, and his mother was a homemaker. When he was 7 years old, he got a younger brother, Daniel, who became his father's favorite. Berdella did very well in school, though teachers found him difficult to teach, and he was sometimes bullied by other students. He was severely nearsighted and had to start wearing thick glasses at the age of 5. When Berdella was 16, his life took a dive for the worst. First, his father died of a heart attack at the age of 39. His mother remarried shortly afterwards, to his resentment and anger. In his youth, Robert Berdella watched a 1965 adaptation of the Robert Fowles book, The Collector, which is about a man who abducts a young woman and holds her captive in his basement. It was a movie that made a lasting impression on him. Fast forward to 1967. At the age of 18, Berdella enrolled in the Kansas City Art Institute, hoping to become a professor. But things didn't work out as planned, so instead he pursued a career as a chef. It was around this point in his life that Robert started to display a propensity for the sinister. During his time in art school, he engaged in animal torture at least 3 times. During 2 of them, he tortured a duck and a chicken, and on the 3rd, he experimented with sedatives and tranquilizers on a dog. Soon after, he began a criminal career selling drugs. At the age of 19, he was arrested for possession of LSD and marijuana, but was released after only 5 days due to a lack of evidence. In 1969, Berdella left the Kansas City Art Institute after getting criticized for killing and cooking a duck as part of his art. He decided to stay in Kansas City and moved to a place in Charlotte Street in the Hyde Park district. He became a successful chef full-time. As a member of the local Chefs Association, he helped set up a training program for aspiring chefs. He was, ironically enough, also a member of his local crime prevention and neighborhood watch association. At this point, Berdella was openly gay and started spending a lot of time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, criminals, and runaways, although he allegedly didn't have any physical relationships with them. At the age of 32, he quit working as a cook and instead opened his own store called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, which sold all kinds of oddities and antiques. During his time at work, Berdella got to know a fellow merchant named Paul Howell, whose booth was next to his own. Eventually, he also became acquainted with Paul Howell's younger son, Jerry. Initially, Jerry Howell and his friends mocked and teased him for being openly gay. However, according to Berdella, Jerry Howell later confided in him that he and his friends sometimes earned money as male prostitutes. How very ironic. Despite occasional heated arguments between Jerry Howell and Berdella, they would go on to kindle a casual friendship. At least that's how it looked to everybody else. Robert Berdella had other things in mind. On July 5th, 1984, Berdella took his victim, and it was none other than 19-year-old Jerry Howell, the boy he had become such good friends with. Alas, it was that friendship that sealed young Howell's fate. Berdella had abducted Howell after promising to drive him to a dancing contest. He fed the young man a cocktail of alcohol, Valium, and asapromazine, both in his car and at his house until he fell unconscious. Berdella then injected him with a strong tranquilizer and bound him to his bed. Howell remained restrained on Berdella's bed for a horrifying 28 hours, undergoing an excruciating amount of torture. Berdella repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and subjected Howell to various forms of sexual abuse. The whole time, Howell begged and pleaded with him to explain why he was torturing him, pleading for release. but Berdella didn't care. Jerry Howell ultimately died from asphyxiation after choking on his own vomit, or from a combination of the gag and the drugs rendering him unable to breathe. Berdella briefly attempted to resuscitate Howell, but was unsuccessful. He then moved his lifeless body to the basement, suspending it over a large cooking pot. Berdella made incisions in Howell's inner elbows and jugular vein to drain his blood, leaving the body in this position overnight. The following day, he dismembered Howell's remains using a chainsaw and boning knives. He wrapped the body parts in newspaper and trash bags, which were then placed inside larger bags for disposal by the garbage crew at a landfill. Around the time of Howell's murder, Berdella was actually questioned by investigators looking into Howell's disappearance, but his alibi was set. He drove the young man to a dancing competition and left him there, Berdella told the police. And just like that, he got away with murder. Berdella's depraved serial murders aren't just unique for the incredible amount of torture he put his victims through. He also had a sick habit of meticulously writing down every single detail of his torture inside a notebook. He recorded every act of sexual and physical torture he inflicted on his victims, as well as their reactions. When he was ultimately questioned about his heinous acts, Berdella maintained that his actions were not for his own enjoyment, but rather for what he termed his physical and mental satisfaction. And he was just getting started. In April 1985, Robert Sheldon, a former lodger of Berdella's, approached him asking to stay at his house temporarily. Although Berdella considered Sheldon an inconvenience and wasn't attracted to him, he decided to drug and capture him when he found Sheldon intoxicated in his home. He would then proceed to torture the poor man. Berdella claimed he didn't hold strong malice towards Sheldon. Instead, he saw him as an outlet he could express some of the anger and frustration that I had toward other people on. Sheldon was drugged and held captive in a bedroom for 3 days, enduring various forms of torture. He had drain cleaner put in his eye, needles inserted under his fingernails, and his wrists were bound with piano wire to the point of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands. Eventually, Berdella suffocated Sheldon by placing a sack over his head and tightened it with a rope. He later dismembered Sheldon's body in the bathroom. 2 months later, Berdella encountered his next victim, Mark Wallace, a man who was seeking shelter from a storm in his tool shed. Similar to Sheldon, Berdella invited him inside. Once inside, Berdella noticed that Wallace appeared to be tense and looked depressed, so he offered to inject him with chlorpromazine, convincing him that it would calm him down. Tragically, Wallace took him up on his offer and willingly accepted the injection. What he woke up to, however, was hell on earth. Wallace endured a day of captivity and torture, including electrical shocks to his body and the insertion of multiple hypodermic needles into his muscles. Berdella claimed Wallace died to a combination of the drugs, the gag, and the lack of oxygen. From here, Berdella's methods would only grow more gruesome. On September 26, 1985, Berdella agreed to let an acquaintance of his, Walter James Ferris, stay at his house for a brief period. This was just a cover for the dastardly desires Berdella had in store for him. Ferris was drugged with tranquilizers, and Berdella tied him to his bed where he subjected the man to relentless torture for approximately 27 hours. This included administering high-voltage electrical shocks to his shoulders and testicles for up to 5 minutes each time, and using hypodermic needles for acupuncture in his neck and genitals. Ferris gradually became delirious, but Berdella continued his physical and sexual assaults, until, as he noted in his logbook, Ferris was unable to sit up for more than a few seconds. Shortly after, he recorded very delayed breathing, followed by the simple entry 86, which was a slang term he had used in his career as a chef, a term that meant anything from throw it out to stop the project. Walter James Ferris was dead. His next victim came in June 1986. Robert Berdella encountered a 23-year-old male prostitute named Todd Stoops, another acquaintance of his. Berdella invited Stoops to his house for lunch, with the added incentive of sex and a payday. But of course, Berdella had sinister intentions. Berdella was physically attracted to Stoops, and after capturing him, held him captive for 2 weeks. during which he subjected him to horrifying acts in an attempt to control and incapacitate him. Berdella put a great deal of effort into terrifying Stoops and making him a cooperative and incapacitated sex slave. This included administering electrical shocks to his closed eyes, trying to blind him, and injecting drain cleaner into his throat to render him mute, although this was unsuccessful. As Stoops grew weaker and more compliant, he asked Berdella for a soft drink and a sandwich, but Berdella refused, causing Stoops to break down in tears. Towards the end of Stoops' captivity, Berdella attempted to feed him ice cream and soup, but Stoops was too weak to keep anything down and had difficulty breathing while sitting. Berdella believed that Stoops died from a combination of fever and blood loss caused by the repeated sexual assaults and the abuse he had endured. The next year, Berdella had found himself his next victim, a 20-year-old named Larry Wayne Pearson, who had an interest in witchcraft and wizardry. Pearson temporarily stayed with Berdella and performed chores in exchange for lodging. Apparently, Robert Berdella did not plan to capture Pearson initially, but his intention changed when Pearson joked about robbing gay men in the past. Certainly the last thing you'd want to tell the gay serial killer you live with. On June 23rd, Berdella got Pearson drunk and injected him with chlorpromazine before taking him to the basement. He tied Pearson's hands above his head and injected drain cleaner into his throat. Berdella also brought an electrical transformer to the basement and proceeded to put Pearson through some of the worst pain imaginable. Berdella claimed that Pearson was the most cooperative of his victims. After 5 days of torture, which wasn't just the electrical shocks, but breaking the bones in his hand with an iron rod, Pearson became submissive and cooperated with Berdella's torture and sexual abuse in order to earn his trust. As a reward, Berdella moved him to the second floor and promised to inflict less pain if he cooperated. Pearson even trained himself to sleep without moving to avoid provoking Berdella and inviting further torture. After 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson couldn't take it anymore and bit Berdella's penis in an act of desperation. In response, Berdella bludgeoned Pearson unconscious with a tree limb and suffocated him with a bag and ligature. Pearson's body was dismembered in the basement and his head was initially kept in the freezer before being buried in the backyard. Like many serial killers, Berdella's reign had to come to an end at some point, and that's what happened in March 1988. That was when Robert Berdella abducted his final victim, Christopher Bryson, a 22-year-old male prostitute. Berdella lured Bryson to his house under the promise of payment for sex. Once at his home, Berdella knocked him unconscious and bound him to a bed. Bryson was subjected to similar forms of abuse and torture as Berdella's previous victims. Bryson managed to win Berdella's trust, and they could even discuss the aspects of abuse Berdella would put him through. But of course, there would be no negotiation regarding the sexual abuse. He convinced Berdella to tie his hands in front of him instead of above his head, citing blood circulation issues. He also persuaded Berdella to leave the television out of the room and keep the remote control within reach when he was away. Not too long after that, Christopher Bryson made a break for it. He managed to break free by burning through his restraints with matches left in the room, after which he escaped from the house by jumping out of a second-floor window wearing only a dog collar. He ran toward a meter reader across the street and asked them to call the police. When questioned by police officers, Bryson initially claimed he had been hitchhiking and was abducted, raped, and tortured by Berdella for 4 days before escaping. The officers noticed his injuries, including swollen eyes, scars, and welts, and he was taken to the hospital. Not too long after that, the police were at Berdella's door with a search warrant. Berdella was arrested on charges related to the sexual assault of Christopher Bryson. When investigators searched his property, they found evidence supporting Bryson's claims of being restrained and tortured. In a second-floor bedroom, burnt ropes were discovered attached to the bedposts, along with an electrical transformer connected to the bed. The room also contained syringes, prescription drug bottles, swabs, eye drops, an iron pipe, ropes, and belts. Further searches of Berdella's house and grounds led to the discovery of a human skull in a closet on the second floor and a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. Human vertebrae with marks from hacksaws and knives were found in a hallway, and human teeth were found in 2 envelopes. In the basement, investigators found a hacksaw, a miter saw, and a chainsaw stained with blood, flesh, and pubic hairs. Luminal tests revealed extensive bloodstains on the basement floor and 2 plastic trash barrels. A search also revealed 334 Polaroid pictures and 34 snapshot prints of various men. These images depicted Christopher Bryson and other individuals, both alive and dead, many of whom had been tortured. The search also uncovered restraining and sexual devices, pornographic literature, hypodermic needles, and a book about narcotics. In one bedroom, a stenographer's pad containing detailed torture logs of each victim was found, along with newspaper clippings about a missing man named Jerry Howell. Additionally, a wallet and a driver's license belonging to a missing person named Walter James Ferris were discovered in a closet on the second floor of the house. On July 22, 1988, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, punished for the many heinous crimes committed against the people unfortunate enough to have ever trusted Robert Berdella. There's a lot more where this came from, here at the Murder Encyclopedia.